Alrighty. Sorry about that. I've had to update OBS and apparently it changed a bunch of my settings. Yoki, why are you whining so much? Why are you whining so much? I know, buddy. I know. I know. Poor boyo had a surgery. His hip was dislocated.
Alrighty. So.
Anyway, I did a whole intro and my freaking mic was... I was on the wrong mic because it defaulted when the settings changed. My desktop audio looks like wasn't playing either. I had music playing. Can I change that quickly? Probably that one. All right, puppy dog wants to go out. Just a second. Alrighty. So, yes. So, my intro all over again. I'm Steve. Welcome to my channel, Re-Vera. Let me fix that since I moved it for the puppy dog. And today I wanted to discuss whether all conservatives are racist. Or most. Not all. So I made a comment in reply to a conservative I've just talked to before, Adam Friended. I've debated him on his channel. He obviously has 2 channels. He's pretty big. Last time I checked, he's like 70,000 subs. Way bigger than me, obviously. And we had a pretty good conversation. But I follow him on Twitter, and sometimes I reply to his stuff. And he made a comment mocking about how leftists think that like white supremacy is all over the place. And I was like, well, yeah, it is. And I said I could demonstrate it. And that became controversial. A bunch of people have been debating me on Twitter. And I kind of want to go through it. One of the reasons was these tweets might disappear. People have a tendency to delete stuff when they start getting embarrassed by it. And so I wanted to go through it. Another thing is, if the best way to change people's mind is in person, to build rapport, get past people's defenses. I've made videos about this before. It's not easily done online. And if you're online, you're probably not going to change people's mind. That doesn't mean we should not be online, though. We shouldn't just leave it for people on the right to dominate the discourse. If you're going to be online, I think the best way to do it is to be as logical and simple and rhetorically effective as possible. So personally, I think I do a pretty good job of that. You can let me know if you disagree. But let's cover some stuff. Hey, Bensel Chaparino, welcome to the chat. Let's say hypothetically you are a conservative. What's your point? Let's see. Let me just get back to the original thread. I think this person was responding to it at some point. Here we go. Okay, so this is the original tweet that started the whole thing. Oh, you can't see. There we go. Okay. So Adam Friended posted about Skyler. Don't even know who the heck he is. Don't care. But he says, if you tell him white supremacy is everywhere based on no evidence, he gobbles it right up. Welcome to Skyler's new religion. So I replied, I can demonstrate very easily that white supremacy is everywhere. Most conservatives are factually racist or white supremacist, depending on definitions, and it only takes a few questions to get there. And obviously, when you come into a hostile echo chamber, you can expect to get pounced on for such a controversial take. I think my wife's getting home, so the dogs are going to make some noise. Sorry about that. Got a whole pack of hound dogs here. So, this sounds controversial to a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to think that, basically half the country, 40% of the country are bad people. And I'm not saying they're bad people. So let me clarify. And I'll clarify this more as we go through. It's a lot easier to do a good job debating in text form, which I'm happen to be really good at, than to try to recap it, but we're going to go for it. So again, it is morally wrong to be racist. I'm going to define racism. We're going to get into all that. But that doesn't make somebody like generally someone you would think of as a bad person when you meet them. Like you could hang out with most conservatives and they'd be great people. They help you out. They'll help you change your tire if they pass you on the road. A lot of people, like, these aren't like horrible bad people that go around beating everybody. All right. But that doesn't actually make anything better, because it seems controversial to say that 40% of people believe something morally bad and harmful, and yet 40% of Germany put Hitler in power on a platform of racism. The people of Germany weren't different in any real significant way than the people of the United States. People can believe harmful, wrong things, whether it's through ignorance or their material conditions or their environment or what have you. It doesn't make them not wrong or not morally harmful. So the purpose here is to try to educate people so they can see why those beliefs are wrong and hopefully change them. So I'm not trying to just shame people here and alienate them. The point is, your beliefs are wrong. Here's why. Please change them. Right? And then demonstrate it very clearly and logically. So, I was trying to reply to all the replies and it was getting out of hand. So eventually I just made a tweet train to kind of lay out my argument. So I'll go over that. That'll be the easiest way to go through it. So I'm using the following most of the initial replies, like if you go through it, like most of them are depending on definitions. Like I'm playing some fast and loose with definitions to try to, get one over on you. No, it's a pretty easy definition of racism. I'm not playing definition games here. It's just philosophy 101 to clarify your definitions before you start on a conversation. That's all. I just want to clarify definitions. My definition is the definition I'm using here, there's obviously multiple, is the belief that other ethnic groups are innately inferior to your own. So if you disagree with it, say why and provide an alternative, and I'll either agree to use yours or discuss why it might not be useful. This is basic philosophy. This is how anybody that's intellectually honest handles debate. And yet that's wildly controversial on conservative sides. Intellectual honesty is not something that's common on the conservative side, I'm sorry to say. But let's check. What's the definition of racist? A person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. Personally, I think if you're showing discrimination, I think that believing a particular race is superior to another without significant evidence of that is feeling discrimination or prejudice. Like, yeah, this is all I'm saying. Now, I'm focusing on racism instead of white supremacy, because every white supremacist out there is going to be like, well, I'm not a white supremacist because there's this one population of like 100 people that's way smarter than white people. Therefore, I don't think we're supreme because that other group is supreme of 100 people. It's stupid. Who cares if you think some other group is superior to white people? You're using that as an excuse. What matters is whether you think your race or white people are superior to other races. That's the core point, and that's what the definition of racism. That's what we're going with. So there's some qualifiers here that are very important. And when you're debating online, especially when you're in a hostile echo chamber and you're going to get piled on, it's be careful. Yeah, it's very important to be careful with your language. So, sorry about that. So, just checking the audio here, making sure I'm working. Philosophical Fish, hola, welcome. Going over a good old Twitter debate I had. Whether most conservatives are racist or not. And so the definition of racism I'm using, the belief that other ethnic groups are innately inferior to your own. So innately is important, because if you're talking about something that's objectively quantifiable, that most people agree is a measure of, superiority, inferiority, things like wealth, things like education, Things like IQ, like most people agree more wealth better than less wealth. Higher IQ better than lower IQ. Like, IQ is all messy and, it's not a great judge of stuff, but most people would prefer to have a higher IQ than a lower IQ. According to many of these things, or crime statistics is another one, black people they have inferior outcomes. Let's say that. We know that. That's a matter of statistics, and I'm not denying that. The question is, why do they have those poor outcomes? Is it innate or not? So the innately qualifier is very important there. And based on more discussions that happen later, another qualifier to add is without strong evidence supporting the claim. Because if it was a fact that some group was demonstrably inferior in some way, there's nothing wrong with stating facts. I'm not against facts. My channel's Re-Vera. It's about truth. So, for instance, populations of pygmies are probably inferior at playing basketball to populations of Samoans that are like 8 feet tall on average. Obviously. But we're talking about things that matter to people's lives a little bit more than basketball. We're talking about more innate qualities. Whether people are naturally prone to crime and violence, whether they're naturally lower IQ. That kind of stuff is a lot more personal. It's a lot more important. It's a lot more basic. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about when we're talking about comparing black and white people, for instance. If you believe that black people are innately inferior to white people, you're racist. And most conservatives are. So let's go into it. The next tweet said, it's a clear fact that there are substantial differences in outcomes between people considered black and white in America. There's a 10-to-1 wealth gap, which is wild. That's huge, obviously. So when there's a 10-to-1 wealth gap between white and black people, obviously there's going to be correspondingly higher differences in poverty, crime, education, housing, even IQ, because IQ is affected by development and education and nutrition going up, and whether you have lead on your walls, which is based on poverty because it's been illegal for a long time. So old houses are more likely to have it, and all this kind of stuff. So that's all pretty plain. Like, those are just facts. The question is why. There are only two ways to explain differences between groups. It's either genetics, innate, or it's environment. Honestly, I didn't even get much pushback on this. It's pretty much commonly accepted. Like, it's the nature versus nurture thing. If there's a difference between groups of people, it's either the environment or it's their genetics. Virtually all conservative pundits and politicians deny the existence of systemic racism, as do most conservatives. If you ask most conservatives why the different outcomes, they say culture. Okay, why do they have a bad culture? Could that be because of socioeconomic factors, which is systemic racism? Like, systemic racism is socioeconomic factors. That's what we're talking about. It's not just like laws that are explicitly racist. If not, you're saying they have a bad culture because of innate genetics. Again, there's no escaping the environment versus genetics thing. It is either innate or it's the environment. And if it's the environment, then we should change it. Right? They might say it's because of bad personal choices, but why do you think they make bad personal choices? It's either environment or genetics. Again, if you think an entire people group, on average, makes poor decisions, you are saying they're inferior to you. So why? Is it innate or environment? If it's environment, we should do something about it. Right? If you're saying their inferior outcomes is because of innate genetic differences, you are racist. This is easy. Like, you can do this in conversation with any conservative. You can just simply ask them, why do you think there's a 10-to-1 wealth gap between black people and white people? And then you keep asking questions. They'll say bad personal choices. They'll say culture. Maybe they'll come up with something else. But then you say, okay, but why that? Because everything reduces to either the environment or the genetics. And if you deny all the environmental factors, you are saying it's innate and genetic, which means you are racist by definition. And most conservatives do this. Most pundits and politicians deny the existence of systemic racism, which is the environment. That's what we're talking about. So I can get into some of the specific objections there, and if somebody in chat wants to sound off their own, I'll be glad to cover that. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time going through some replies and some stuff on all of this that I've already covered. But then I'm going to go into, there's another guy who has like 30,000 subs on YouTube that I got into a full-on debate with him. He started off with a 30-tweet thread responding to my initial argument before I even knew he was responding. And I was responding hot and heavy. He quote tweeted my initial chain and then just bloop, 30 tweets. So I probably have hundreds of tweets going back and forth with him, and I might have a debate with him later. I'd love to. So we'll see. He's already asking to get on Voice. So anyway, and obviously I'm not trying to hide names. I'm a small channel. This is a public forum. If you don't, you should be willing to stand behind what you say. It's in public. So I'm not gonna. This isn't doxing anybody. If I was a big channel picking on one specific person, that might be a different story. Anyway, no one denies environmental factors, but why anyone makes bad choices is for that person to figure out, not me. When I was growing up in the ghetto, my friends made bad choices because their parents also made bad choices. Blah blah blah. And then this is Adam Friended. You know, he has 70,000 subs. I've talked to him on YouTube. We had a debate. How dare you say black people can make bad choices? That's racist. No, if a group of people in general, on average, makes bad choices, that's clearly saying they are inferior. And their outcomes and choices are worse. The question is why. It's either it's either the environment or genetics. If you deny the former, you imply the latter. And of course, this is one of the objections a lot of people might come up with, which is, why is systemic racism the only form of environment? It's a valid question. And people have brought up like other cultures and other examples. Again, not talking about them, not talking about other countries. We're talking about African Americans living in this country, brought here as slaves, living as a minority in a country controlled by the majority, where they had no control over their lives and the policies affecting them for literally hundreds of years. Their entire environment has been shaped by the politics and policies of the majority since the 1600s. And if you think that hasn't shaped their environment and their culture, you're kind of just denying reality. So every time this has come up, I've asked people, what is an example of an environmental factor leading to poorer outcomes for black people that isn't systemic racism? I've asked this dozens of times. Have not got a clear answer out of anybody. So we can see that as we continue. Bad parenting. Why are people bad parents? Ask them, not a fortune teller. Well, I didn't continue, obviously, but the point is, people are bad parents because of poverty, because they have to work 3 jobs, because daddy's in prison because he was busted for marijuana, because there's a drug war that exists because they wanted to target black people. That's on the record. Nixon said the purpose of the drug war was to target black people and leftists. Like that's on the record. I actually had somebody, I don't know if I'll find that tweet right away, but somebody actually brought that up as a point. Was like, well, the hip-hop culture glorifying marijuana has led a lot of black people to get into the drug trade. Do you not agree with that? The majority of marijuana use was by black people decades before hip-hop even fucking existed. That's why Nixon made it illegal, so he could target them. I mean, it's on the record. It's very entertaining. I've gotten so many bad replies off of all of this. All right, let's go through a few more. Depending on definitions. This is the most common initial objection by all of them. Depending on definitions. See one more. Everything is anything depending on definitions. So many conservatives seem to have an objection to the idea of clarifying definitions. It's weird. It is a fact that most words have multiple definitions. That is a fact. Check your dictionary. It is a fact that if you do not clarify definitions, you're probably going to commit equivocation, which is dishonest. Anybody who doesn't clarify definitions is dishonest. Don't let anybody pretend that clarifying definitions makes you dishonest, because that's ass backwards. I don't have any problem. You're tarring them all with... People love to do projection. And I've gotten so many claims of stuff that is nothing like what I said that it's ridiculous. The vagary of using different definitions, so you don't need to back up that claim with actual evidence. A, I said most, not all. B, I clearly defined racism. C, I clearly backed up my clear definition with clear evidence. And then I linked the full thread. Alrighty. If you say so. This is common too. Everybody wants to pretend that we're blowing everything out of proportion, and it's all hyperbole. Left's turned everything into white power Nazi conspiracies. There's no way out of this hyperbole. Trump isn't Hitler. The Proud Boys aren't the SA. Well, we have concentration camps. We put hundreds of thousands of people who are legal asylum seekers by our Constitution and international law. Which, could I pull that up real quick? Because this is an important point that often gets missed. The point is, the Constitution says that treaties that the U.S. agrees to override all the laws of the land except for the Constitution itself. And then, so you can quote that article of the Constitution, and then you can quote the actual international treaty we agreed to, and voila, it is illegal. Here. Yeah, asylum seekers aren't breaking the law. Article 6, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. Only thing they don't supersede is the U.S. Constitution itself. International treaties we sign are U.S. law. 1967 protocol relating to the status of refugees is a treaty we signed. Thus, based on the Constitution, it is U.S. law. Go to Article 31 of the treaty. Refugees unlawfully in the country of refugee. The contracting states shall not impose penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence on refugees who, coming directly from a territory where their life or freedom was threatened in the sense of Article 1, enter or are present in their territory without authorization, provided they prevent themselves without delay to the authorities and show good cause for their illegal entry or presence. The contract, point 2. The contracting state shall not apply to the movements of such refugees restrictions other than those which are necessary, and such restrictions shall only be applied until their status in the country is regularized or they obtain admission into another country. The contracting states shall allow such refugees a reasonable period and all the necessary facilities to obtain admission into another countries. Keeping them in a concentration camp is not all necessary facilities. It's also imposing absurd restrictions and just generally violating the entire thing. And they are concentration camps. These are conditions. It's illegal to keep serial killers in. You can't keep serial killers in these conditions. We have laws governing how we can keep prisoners, but they don't count because they're not citizens, so those laws don't apply to them, apparently. But the conditions are horrible. There's been 4,500 charges of abuse and sexual harassment and rape by minors in the 4 years Trump's been president. 4,500. It's come out recently that some of these facilities are spraying literally toxic chemicals on everybody, trying to sterilize everything. It says right on the bottle not to touch it, not to breathe it, and they have no ability to protect themselves from it. You know, then you have the forced sterilizations. Like, where's the hyperbole? We have concentration camps that are illegal by our own law. That might not be a death camp yet, but guess what? Hitler didn't start off with death camps and ovens. He didn't run on that shit. So we're directly comparable to early Hitler, certainly. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. Alf went on and on and on. A lot of people like this is he seems like honestly like a stereotypical brown-skinned conservative. I think he's very honest. I don't think he's lying. I don't think he's a token. But there is a lot of people who just don't want to admit that their demographic has been victimized because it doesn't feel good to be a victim. I understand that. It doesn't change the fact. And did a lot of discussion. Depends on definitions. Well, I did define it. Hey, welcome, Dad. I started linking this to everybody because I couldn't reply to everybody, but I still got a lot of replies. This was a common objection. Again, socioeconomic factors are an entire category of factors that includes those that are purely social. Your reduction of that to nothing but systemic racism is ludicrous. And so, again, like I did dozens of times in it, that blew up. Please give an example of a socioeconomic factor that isn't part of systemic racism. And they finally, much later, said family structure, subcultural trends, job availability, and restrictions on small business. But those aren't specific examples. Like, what do you mean family structure? What cultural trends? What do you mean job availability? I asked for a specific example and you gave none. And then they came back and they said, if there are less jobs available in areas with a higher number of X people will be likely to be poorer overall. Why do I need to explain this? Because job availability doesn't mean anything. I actually replied to that twice. Sounds like they're saying, do you mean black areas have less jobs? Is it not systemic racism that they were literally legally required to be separate from white society for hundreds of years and that redlining continued basically to this day? There's still evidence of redlining, less severe than it used to be, no longer legal, still happens. But yes, that is a thing, and it does make it harder for black people to move. And then, if you actually engage in logical discussion with these people, they're their own worst enemies. It's hilarious. High levels of cannabis use this is actually the tweet I mentioned like 5 minutes ago. But high levels of cannabis use as a status symbol within the hip hop community puts pressure on young men to enter the drug trade. Am I wrong to suggest that these young men may be disproportionately black? It was disproportionately black use before it was illegal. I didn't see that reply yet. Oh, that's hilarious. Of course, that has to do with the point. I did not say it's not the result of systemic racism. How is it not systemic racism to find something that one demographic does more than other demographics and then make it illegal just because they do it? That's systemic racism. Obviously. I'm not going to sit here typing. I'll have to respond to that later. That's some good stuff. Oh, but I provided evidence. Narrow-minded much. Narrow-minded much? You're narrow-mindedly assuming I'm wrong without considering the possibility I'm not. Challenging other echo chambers is not narrow-minded. Like literally. Like my initial comment was retweeted 13 times, replied to 30 times without a single like. That's a hostile echo chamber. How the fuck am I the narrow-minded one? It makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah. Okay. Nothing much there. Okay. This is all. There's a lot of replies to this, and a lot of it's interesting. But I wanted to get into the main reply, which is by the Distributist, who has a channel on YouTube which is almost 30K subs. And we spent a lot of time debating this specifically. Like I said, he replied. Here, let me go to the beginning if I can. Here we go. So his first reply before I knew he was here was a 30 tweet chain. So 11, 16, 27, all the way to 30. 30 tweet chain. And I think he thought I probably wasn't going to reply. And maybe not. Maybe he wanted a good conversation. I don't know. We might have a debate yet. But I have responded to every one of his comments. And none of his points are good. And some of them are hilariously bad. So I wanted to share them with you before anything gets deleted. Because we all know embarrassed Nazis sometimes start deleting shit. And our most recent exchange, before I left work and came here and started streaming, was he got offended that I used the N-word, Nazi, when he's been defending considering people, another group of people innately inferior the whole time. Like, that is what is offensive about Nazis. Like, that's the core problem. He was also insisting on using the word Gentile a lot. Guy's a Nazi. Come on. Anyway, let's just go through his takes. Because I'm glad to engage in the marketplace of ideas. Because leftist ideas are better. And we can prove it. Reading this thread from a progressive atheist on race. Yeah, fair. I'm many labels. I'm a humanist. I'm a libertarian market socialist. But progressive atheist, I'll take it. I want to give an extended take. He clearly demonstrates the existence of a thought-terminating method. So cynical it puts any young Earth creationist to shame. Did I reply to that one specifically? What? Which one was it? Did I reply to? Yeah, what terminates thought for you exactly? The term racist? You say correctly it's a moral proposition. So is rapist. Can we not discuss what is and isn't rape and how to reduce it? Like, these standards he's trying to put forth are wildly insane if you take 2 seconds to think about them. Like, how is it a thought-terminating cliche to use a moral term? We have to be able to discuss morality. That's like the foundation of our justice system and politics in general. It all reduces down to morality. I'm sorry your snowflake feelings are offended by the word racist, but it's a word that exists, has a definition, it's got a moral use, and we need to use it. Wild. The confusion of a moral term with a scientific claim. I of course said, it could be scientifically true that people like you specifically are genetically predetermined to be rapists. Should I claim that as a fact, or should there maybe be a burden of proof first? That's my whole claim. I'm not against truth. I'm not against facts. But if you're going to claim something negative that hurts other people, you should have a burden of proof first before you do that. Otherwise, it's this little thing called libel. And I've made that point a whole lot of times. Believing something negative about other people that hasn't been demonstrated. As you said, I'll get to that, but he said it's an open question. He's pretending, at least, that he doesn't believe it while defending people's ability to believe it. So, this is personalizing a scientific question in order to tilt the scales. This isn't a personal question. It's a question of fact. Now, to back up, what question are we talking about here? We're talking about whether black people are innately inferior to white people. That's not personal at all. Of course it's personal. How can you... Wow. The point of science is to remove human bias and the ability to tilt the scales. It's the whole fucking point of science. That's why scientific method and peer review exists. So he's saying that personalizing the question is going to tilt the scales. But the whole point of science is to prevent the scales from being tilted. That is why scientific methodology exists. So, no. It is a personal question. We shouldn't stop science from doing science, but before you make a claim, you should believe it. And he doesn't seem to even understand what science is, because he seems to think that if you tell people they shouldn't make a claim before there's sufficient evidence for that claim, you're infringing on science's ability to do science. But science doesn't make claims before there is evidence. That's not how science works. The reason they use the term hypothesis is to reinforce that. Because a hypothesis means something that has not been proven yet. And most of what they debate in science is different hypotheses. It is actually unscientific to make a claim before you have evidence for that claim. Instead, you test for the validity of a specific hypothesis before you say you believe it. Did he reply to any of that? All right, let's back up. Let's go through his whole chain here as much as I can without interrupting. So, of course, he thinks he's going to do the bland mainstream conservative thing of he's going to get canceled for his political opinions when he's defending Nazi ideology. Anyway, in summary, the author's logic goes as follows. Given we observe manifest differences in racial performances, there are only 3 or 4 main explanations. And I believe I replied to that. No, there's really 2. There's environment and genetics. It's either nature or nurture. But he says biology and read RR, which is, I'm pretty sure he's just saying is short for race-realist, because it's obviously race-realist. Culture, read CD, which I'm taking to mean cultural differences. Or systemic racism, SR. Mix of above. Read M. Now, a hard question, but he thinks SR is the only choice. Right. Yeah. When you have a minority that was brought to this country against their will and has lived here for 400 years, entirely with their entire lives dictated by a majority they have little to no say in. Most of their history, 0 say. You know, the last 50 years, the Voting Rights Acts, more and more. You know, now that they're actually 13% of the population can actually have a meaningful say when they have a high voter turnout and they all vote in one party. So now they have a little bit more say than they used to. But for 400 years, their entire environment has been shaped by the majority they're not part of. So, yeah. Dissidents who entertain race-realism or conservatives who entertain cultural differences are white supremacist racists, which means they are, by definition, bad people. Again, I started the stream by saying, no, they're not bad people. Like, a lot of most conservatives, if you meet them, you hang out with them, you go to the beach with them, you stay with them for a week, whatever, you'll think, oh man, these are nice people. And they are. Like, my family's conservative. They're nice people. I love them. That doesn't mean they can't have morally harmful beliefs that are immoral and that they should not have. Again, 40% of Germany put Hitler in power. That's a huge swath of the population. They were wrong. Now, not all of those people who voted for Hitler and his party in Germany were bad people. Like, I'm sure a lot of those people would stop and help a Jew change your tire. You know, that's how these things work. It like escalates and escalates through time and gets worse, but just because they believe that another group is innately inferior or innately superior, and either way targeting them or however that they justify it, that doesn't make them bad people in all ways. But they do hold harmful beliefs. If you believe another group is innately inferior without evidence, that is a bad belief. It is morally harmful. This isn't difficult. From the beginning, our race-realism and mixed are flat out racist and therefore out of consideration. They are flat out racist by the literal definition. Let me go back. A person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. So yes, race realism, or even people just think it's partially race realism, are by definition racist. That is the definition of the word. I'm sorry if that triggers you, Snowflake. That is the word. Sometimes progressives imply that there's another conversation to have on whether race realism or mixed are actually true. This is bullshit. Progressives have been canceling scientists and thinkers for speculating about race realism. Racism isn't the beginning of a conversation, it's the end. And yet, we've had hundreds of tweets since then. It somehow didn't stop the conversation. Amazing. I'm even willing to debate them on it. Like I said, it's not a thought-terminating cliche to use moral language. We have to be able to discuss morality. It's no different to call somebody racist as any other moral word. There's rapist, there's, lazy, these all have moral implications, and we got to be able to talk about them. But we still have to consider cultural differences, right? Have we considered the circumstances led to the cultural differences? Yes. That's explicitly part of my argument. The argument is it's either environment or genetics. If you disregard the environmental factors, you are clearly implicating it's genetic. So cultural differences are not a third horn to the dilemma. It is still environmental genetics. What causes bad culture? Now, if they have a bad culture, which they claim they not enough fathers and lazy, prone to crime, whatever cultural differences you claim exist, the question is, why do they exist? The ones that you can actually demonstrate exist. It's either the environment or genetics. If we can change the environment, and if it's leading to grossly poorer outcomes for a whole group of people, we should want to change the environment for them, obviously. This trick is done fast, but progressives exclude out of hand the existence of deep cultural difference, even while we observe these emerging independent of race. Thank you for posting my tweets. Yes, I already covered my initial thread. Having excluded RR and M and reducing CD to SR or RR, which it is, the only remaining option is SR. So QED racist, a brilliant proof. Actually, an ideological trap. Let's walk through this slowly. Let's do it. First problem, predictably, is the equivocation on racism. Racism is a moral proposition. That's how most people use it. That's how the left uses it. As such, moral propositions should concern either good action or aesthetic proscription. It should rather than is. Fucking Twitter. It's mixing up all my stuff. Okay, so it's just putting it at the bottom of the chain. But anyway, yes, I agree with all of that. That is completely true. Right. We shouldn't believe other ethnic groups are innately inferior. We should not. Moral language. Certainly without meeting the burden of proof on that claim. It is a moral proposition. There isn't equivocation here. I clearly defined it. And then he says, is it a moral claim or a factual one? It's both, obviously. It's dishonest to pretend it can't be both. It's immoral to make a negative factual claim against other people without meeting a burden of proof. Literally illegal as libel in most countries. And he says, I think this hard stops the conversation. If you can create moral blocks to factual claims, then we'll radically different how we feel you can conduct science. Anyway, let me continue through his argument before we go down all the branching trees here. Where was I? So yes, I agreed with this one. It is a moral proposition. That is how people use it, and that is how I used it. There was no equivocation. Creating moral propositions around natural statements of fact, true or not, is a big no-no. It means there could be hate facts or states of the universe where we condemn reality for being evil, for not conforming to our wishes about how things should be. And that there is a legitimate cause for concern here. My channel's name is Re-Vera because truth matters. I believe in truth. My whole channel is about truth. I care more about truth than anybody I've ever met. I've spent the last decade studying epistemology and standards of evidence and learning how to think critically so I can be better at gaining truth. This matters. You can't forbid fields of study. Reality is what it is. If reality showed that a group of people was innately inferior in some way, we would have to accept that, and then we would have to discuss what that means and what to do about it. But like I said at the end of my first chain, that's a separate argument. If you believe that that another group is innately inferior to yours, then we can have that discussion. But that's a different discussion than whether most conservatives believe that. You're actually proving my point, because if you're going to argue that, you are by definition racist. So anyway, that's a separate conversation. Whether racism is true is different from whether most conservatives are racist. So let's go through his whole example here. For example, if we say that it is immoral to believe in the existence of purple cows, we have created... Let me make this easier to read. Probably should have done that sooner. He goes in this whole fucking thing about purple cows. We've created a situation believing the truth can be evil. Sure, I don't see any purple cows now, but somewhere on the planet Zonga, there might be a purple cow. Therefore, the existence of moral standard will actively prevent my discovery of the purple cow. Explorers who come back from planet Zongo can be dismissed as liars when they report purple cows because they are evil. Now, we partially can mitigate the destructiveness of descriptive moral propositions by either making them entirely abstract, belief in Platonic forms, or manifestly demonstrably true, objects follow the other. But are either of these properties true for race realism? Is race realism impossible? Is there some principle that excludes it from being true? Absolutely. Is there even overwhelming evidence that it is not true? My conclusion after years of looking for this is no. Race realism can safely be described as open or unknown. That is important, and I've been holding him to that for this whole debate, because that's an important admission right there. He is saying it's an open question. He's not saying the burden of proof has been met that another group is innately inferior. He's saying it's possible. That's important. Burden of proof matters. Now, to answer the question, is race realism impossible? Is it possible that another group of people is innately inferior? I already handled this at the beginning of the stream. Pygmies are innately inferior to Samoans when it comes to basketball because they're much shorter. Obviously, groups can be innately inferior in some ways. But if you're going to claim that another group is inferior in ways that matter more than freaking sports, such as intelligence, prone to crime, laziness, like whether they're poor because they're just bad at stuff, that kind of stuff. Basically stuff that makes you human. If you're somehow less human, that has a pretty high burden of proof, and you should meet it before you claim it or believe it. So that's the point. It's not that it's impossible. It's not that it shouldn't even be studied. It's that if you believe it without good evidence, that's wrong. And yes, I already said this to start with. Makes it possible. It makes it an open question. We can talk about standards of evidence, and I will agree with you. Spoiler alert, he doesn't, and he didn't, and he refuses to admit the distinction anywhere in our debate after this point. So no, he isn't talking about standards of evidence. Like, the standard of evidence but hasn't been met by his own statement, and yet he doesn't think it's immoral to think another group of people is innately inferior without the standard of evidence being met. How? So there's a lot going on with this argument that I'd like to get into, but let me see. Is that the end of that? Okay, so that's kind of the end of the purple cows thing. So what happens when we introduce a moral proposition of censor to an open scientific question? Nothing good. We have the same problem as with the explorer reporting on purple cows. The morality gates the truth. Now, okay, that's... Anyway, in one of the subthreads, he says that by my logic, Galileo would be guilty because the church was saying that his belief was harmful, and therefore it was worth condemning him when he said that the Earth went around the sun instead of vice versa. But that's very different because he had evidence. That's kind of important, the evidence thing, which he says isn't there. That's kind of important. Like, that by itself, that's really all you need. But B, whether the Earth goes around the sun or vice versa, it doesn't actually hurt anybody. It's an immaterial belief. So at another point, he said, well, what if we changed it to a different species, and biologists were saying this subspecies is less intelligent than this other subspecies? Like, you wouldn't have moral critiques of them. Of course not. I'm sorry. When you change the species away from humans to other animals, you basically lose all moral context. Biologists talk about rape and murder and theft and all kinds of shit between populations of animals without using moral language, because we don't really care if monkeys steal bananas from other monkeys or even rape each other or kill each other. They're animals. They do what animals do. We'll study them, but we're not judging them. They're wild animals. Morality is for humans. Now, humans do have moral attitudes, and it's fascinating to study their kind of basic morality. But what we consider morality as humans is much more complex, and it requires formal language to even have. So there's really only morality for humans. We need to be able to codify our morality and put it in words, and you need language to do that. And spoiler alert, most humans only care about humans. We don't really care about animals so much. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's what most people put. And morality is about what most people believe. That's what shapes society. So, no, it doesn't matter. The point here is believing something harmful to other people without evidence is wrong. And everybody admits this on some subject. And I've been giving him example after example. We all think little old ladies who are spreading nasty gossip are nasty gossipers. If they're sitting here lying about people, did you know Sharon was cheating on her husband, blah, 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 with no evidence? Do we think that's a good person, or is she engaging in wrong behavior? If I'm a woman who works for a powerful CEO and I falsely accuse him of rape, this is something conservatives all care about a lot and think it's all over the place. If I falsely accuse him of rape, is that moral? Like, what if somebody else accuses him of raping somebody else that's not personally involved and they don't have good evidence of it? It's libel. These accusations hurt people. You can't pretend words can't hurt people. But we don't do that, cries the left. So, really, you wouldn't, for instance, publicly humiliate and cancel the most famous geneticist of the 20th century for speculating on this question. Or blah, 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 blah. Again, this is very important. Scientists can have all kinds of dumbass and harmful opinions. It doesn't make those dumbass, harmful opinions science. Science is done by the scientific method, and it is peer-reviewed. So I thought he was talking about Murray. Turns out he was talking about James Watson. I'm not familiar with James Watson. I looked it up. Very famous geneticist, Nobel Prizes, blah, blah, blah. Lots of good stuff. And I looked through his whole history on Wikipedia there. None of his actual scientific work indicated racism whatsoever. He's talking about comments he made in public and in interviews that his opinion is that like black people are less intelligent than white people because of genetics. And he went over other stereotypes that between ethnic groups that he thinks are because of genetics. Cool. That's like his opinion, man. Just because he's a famous scientist doesn't make it science, because he didn't do science to come up to those opinions. Science is a method. It's not just opinions from people in lab coats. Conservatives don't understand this, or they probably wouldn't be conservative. But the whole key to science is the method. If you don't follow the methodology, you're not doing science. And the bell curve, the main resource for these realists was definitively debunked by everybody immediately. And that's why he was ostracized. It's not because he came up with actual scientific evidence that black people were innately inferior. It's because he didn't, but lied about it. And scientists all over the field proved it, pointed out his methodological errors. He refused to correct it and has been touring for decades, ignoring the errors he's made and refusing to correct them and arguing that people are innately inferior. And this is a guy who burned a fucking cross on the hill over his town when he was a teenager. He's a lifelong racist. Don't pretend his biases don't factor into this. Again, we're not canceling anybody for just studying science. Lots of people have studied science and aren't racist. Lots of people have, looked at the IQ differences between groups. Like, these are legitimate scientific questions, and none of the research has definitively shown any differences that are innate. They show differences that are environmental. Oh, here's the whole Galileo tweet. I thought it was in a subthread. It's just this kind of ideological gate that progressive atheists constantly bemoan when they talk about Galileo centuries ago. So, like, obviously. So, unsurprisingly, it's always progressive atheists who guard against hate facts. Also, Galileo deserved it. What? That's funny. Well, I don't know why he would deserve it. You never know with conservatives. I have no idea if he's trolling or if he means it. You know, a lot of, like, most flat earthers are conservative. Let's be real. Is he deleting my replies or something? Where'd all my replies go? Anyway, let's move on to the next stage, the exclusion of deep cultural differences, or CD in our terminology, from explaining any persistent behavior in between groups. This is less sexy, but the claim is even more insane, he says. First, as before, we observe deep cultural differences literally emerging in places like Korea. Different political orders, different constraints, different random elements create shock, different culture. These differences cannot just be chalked up to racism. And goes on about this a lot. Here's the thing. I never said all cultural differences are systemic racism. And these people keep trying to wedge me in boxes on things I did not say. It's very important to be careful with your language in these kind of discussions. And I am, because I've been doing this for a decade. Very careful with my language. You're unlikely to pin me on something because I'm careful with my language in writing. You know, I'm less practiced at the whole verbal thing, but it's fun to do, so I do it sometimes. Anyway, the point is, we're talking about cultural differences between African Americans who were brought here as slaves and white people. I'm not talking about all cultural differences. There can be all kinds of reasons for different cultural differences in all kinds of different countries, and I don't know everything about all countries. I'm not going to get into all that. It's whataboutism. But Again, slaves were brought here in the 1600s moving forward, and they've been here for hundreds of years. They had their culture stripped away from them entirely. They lost their language, they lost their religion, they lost their legends, they lost all of their culture because they were mixed and matched with people from different tribes. They were forced to speak a different language, or forced into a new religion. Like, what traces of their original culture do they still have? That explain their poor outcomes. This is something I've challenged him on numerous times. Give me an example of a cultural differences in African Americans that extends from before slavery that has caused poorer outcomes. And nobody will be able to answer that. And he's done nothing but avoid the point. I could go on about how this view of culture is infantile and is the essence of bugmen. I don't even know what that's a reference to. Where all culture features are either oppression or consumer choices. However, I don't think I need to take these routes. Cultural differences exist. The point is they're because of things. Again, the drug war was made to target black people, and it targets black people disproportionately to this day because that's what it was designed to do, and it still does. And that hurts them. There is no moral or scientific reason why marijuana should be illegal. It's illegal because it lets them target black people. And, that's just one example. There's a 10-to-1 wealth gap. Why? Because wealth accrues generationally. But black people weren't allowed to accrue wealth generationally for most of their entire history. Like, literally, as slaves, you have zero wealth. Like, you don't own anything, including your own body. You don't own anything. So until, 1860, what have you, they had zero wealth. And then you had 100 years of Jim Crow where they were basically not allowed to accrue wealth. Rich black people who managed to get lucky were horrendously hated and targeted. You have the whole Tulsa thing where they literally bombed a wealthy black neighborhood because they didn't want that to exist. Burned it down, chased people away, killed people. Like, they weren't allowed to accrue wealth. And then even after that was made illegal, you had redlining up until like the 70s. It was legal, I believe. And then it still happens today. There's been studies about, the names. People with black sounding names are less likely to get mortgages. There's people who get their home appraised. And if you have pictures of black people on the wall and you're black and you show the appraiser around versus you show the same house with white pictures and different appraisers, and a white person showing that home, it's worth more. So yes, the cultural differences that lead to poorer outcomes in African American communities are caused by systemic racism. How could they not be? Like, if you think there's a different one, I'm not saying it's impossible. That's why I keep asking, what is the cultural differences that leads to the poor outcomes that is not because of systemic racism? Give me an example. And the only people who have tried have been comically stupid. Like the marijuana thing. Like hip hop leading to marijuana use. When marijuana was made illegal decades before hip hop existed, to target black people because they already used it more than white people while it was legal. This is because progressives will embrace cultural differences anytime a non-white group outperforms genteel whites. This is the first time he used it, but I've been asking about this over and over because I was like, why are you using the word Gentile? That is really fucking weird. If you're not Jewish, why are you using the word Gentile? He uses it constantly. It's really fucking weird. There's only two kinds of people I've ever seen use the term Gentile. It's either Jewish people, which according to Jewish religion, you have Jews and you have Gentiles. That's the all of humanity, Jewish, Gentile. Not really that remarkable. Christians believe the same thing. You're either Christian or you're not Christian. It's pretty common. But if you're not Jewish and you're using the term Gentile, it's usually because you're a Nazi. Kind of weird. Anyway, Gentile whites. What about Asians? That small ethnic category. What about the redacted? Why are they outperforming whites? Progressive answer is not SR, it's CD always. This is not true, and I challenged him on it. Immigrants who voluntarily cross oceans pretty much always outperform. Duh. Obviously, they're likely to be wealthy, educated, and ambitious. Cultural differences can play a role, but this variable can't be ignored, yet RR always ignore it. Here you're trying to explain why Gentiles who cross the ocean underperformed non-Gentiles who crossed the ocean at the exact same time. I don't even know what he's talking about here or why he's calling one Gentile. That's the problem with using the term Gentile. It's not a word we use. I don't know what you're talking about, my dude. What group crossed the ocean at the exact same time and was outperformed by, obviously he's trying to avoid saying Jew. So non-Gentiles are Jews. So he's saying Jews crossed the ocean and outperformed Gentiles who crossed the ocean. Okay. I'm not saying all groups are going to be equal. Obviously, different groups come from different areas and had different amounts of wealth and different amounts of education. They're different. This has nothing to do with African Americans that were brought here as fucking slaves. Because obviously, there's a huge difference between people who were brought as slaves with no wealth and not allowed to accrue wealth for hundreds of years, and people who voluntarily can afford to cross oceans and immigrate and are allowed to. The U.S. doesn't just let anybody immigrate. We have standards. So if you're allowed to immigrate across oceans to the U.S., you're probably going to do better than other groups. Now, there's multiple groups that immigrate here, whether you're talking about Jews or different types of Europeans or Africans. All the race realists, this came up many, many times, talk about how Nigerians do better than, American blacks. Again, they voluntarily came across the ocean. Travel's not cheap. Not everyone's allowed to come. If you're not getting a random sample of Nigerians immigrate here. It's the upper middle class and above that immigrate here. And that's true for any society. It's the same for India. Indians who have immigrated to the U.S. do very well. A lot better than a lot of Indians in India. There's a lot of poverty in India, obviously. It's not a random sample. It's people who are better educated and better off. They have material resources or they wouldn't be able to make it here. Now, obviously, there are people who, are illegally smuggled here, or they, sneak here, or they float over in rafts or what have you. But I'm talking about statistical averages. There are enough people that come here with money voluntarily to make the statistics show that they make more money, because that's how that works. So none of these arguments are worth a shit. Where were we? Gentiles. So no, the progressive answer is not systemic racism. It's not cultural differences either. It's the obvious variable that people crossing oceans voluntarily and allowed to immigrate are better educated and have more resources, obviously. I know for redacted that their overachievement is regularly commented on in their community. They're rightfully proud of this. CD is almost always the explanation. Since he's talking about Gentiles, I have to think he means Jews and just doesn't want to say it for some reason. Really weird. There's nothing offensive about the word Jew. Why would he redact it? Really weird. So yeah, I'm not saying it's impossible for there to be cultural differences that explain stuff. But African American culture is a result of the material conditions they have been forced to have by the majority of the country they live in. If you think their culture, again, they were brought here as slaves, they had all of their culture stripped away, and then it rebuilt over time based on the material conditions of the society they were in with racism, slavery, Jim Crow, etc. So, of course, systemic racism shaped the culture. How could it not? But I say almost always because I know that behind closed doors, the possibility of race-realism that benefits Jews is discussed openly. This conversation is usually non-bigoted, and I appreciate that. How the fuck would that be non-bigoted? Trying to decode these fucking Nazis is ridiculous. What I don't appreciate is the hypocrisy. I know progressives don't reduce CD to CR and SR in all circumstances. I see situations every day where they don't. Anyway, this demonstrates our original proof of systemic racism to be a little more than a constructed mental cage. Each side is hemmed in not by logic but by moral equivocations, double standards, and errors in fact. I really wish we could get beyond this, but as always with progressive atheists, I am not optimistic. Well, again, I replied to all of his points. There's a bazillion comments in all these subthreads and chains that go on and on and on. So, yes, I did reply to it all, and I showed how everything he said was wrong. But if anybody disagrees, I'd love to hear from you. So, might have different people here at the end than I had at the beginning. So just the basic argument, it's very simple. We're defining race as the belief, or racism as the belief that another ethnic group is innately inferior to another group, especially with no evidence to back that up. Excuse me. And there are only two things that explain differences between groups. It is either environment or it is genetics. The environment for African Americans has been shaped by the majority for 400 years. That's shaped their entire environment. If you deny the environmental impacts that lead to the poorer outcomes, you are saying the difference is innate and are therefore racist. And this is, unfortunately, most conservatives. I'm not saying this to laugh or to say all conservatives are bad. I am saying this so hopefully, if you are conservative, you will realize your beliefs are wrong and you will change them. You will learn that systemic racism actually exists and it is important and we should work to address it. Welcome to Black Lives Matters. Anyway, I'm going to keep going real quick. I just wanted to make sure I got kind of recorded most of these replies in case they get deleted. But it's basically the end of the stream. This tweet. Obviously, I was replying to notifications throughout this, so trying to go back and reconstruct it is ridiculous. Not all environment is systemic racism. That's a step you left out. Cool. Give me an example of an environmental factor leading to poor outcomes for American black citizens because of systemic racism. The same cultural factors that cause Jews to outperform Gentiles. Are you Jewish or a Nazi? So yeah, he's making the argument that Jews immigrated here and did better than Native Americans. Not Native Americans, but like the American population that has been here for hundreds of years, which is true. But the Europeans came here hundreds of years ago, and the population has grown to 330 million. There's a lot of diversity in that group. So just they didn't come over at the same time. And now, when people immigrate across the country voluntarily, this is not a random sample. This is the upper end of a population in general. So obviously they're going to have better outcomes. Now, if you're talking about groups that did come here at the same time, I don't know what he's talking about. Irish people, Italian people, whatever. And he's saying Jews did better. Well, there's different reasons for that, but none of this has anything to do with African Americans and the fact that they lived in an environment shaped by systemic racism for hundreds of years. It's completely irrelevant. They came from different places. Jews, a lot of money in the Jewish community came from the whole thing that, Catholic Church wasn't allowed to charge interest, so they made Jewish people bankers, and they got fabulously wealthy because of that. That's just a thing. There's a lot of wealth, and there's a lot of, there might be cultural differences that explain the reasons they do better. I'm not saying there isn't. Obviously, cultural differences exist. But why do they exist, and which cultural differences in African Americans are you saying lead to the poor outcomes specifically? These race realists who think they're so rational and so reasonable just can't be specific. It's really sad. Looks like you didn't reply to most of that. Yeah, so in several of the sub-threads, by the way, he was asking if I do voice chat. I said it was specifically about race realism, because I said the bell curve was debunked and Murray was a horrible person and he lied about stuff and he disagreed and he wanted to debate it. And I said I would be happy to have a debate with you on a different platform, not Twitter, because that kind of discussion gets a lot more in the weeds. It's a lot more technical. It's a lot more it's complex. It's all over the place. And it's something I haven't researched fully myself. So it would, I've watched Sean's video, but I'm not going to have a public debate on it without on an issue that broad. Here's a tip. Verbal debates are only effective at getting closer to truth if you keep the scope of the conversation extremely limited. You want to discuss one point, one argument at a time. Because if you get all up in the weeds, you're not going to get anywhere. It's not going to be productive whatsoever. I'm happy to have that debate in text form on any other platform, not Twitter, because Twitter does not lend itself to it. I said Facebook, Quora, if he has ideas, happy for it. I'm glad to debate other things like this argument. I'll debate this argument all day long on anyone's channel, that most conservatives are in fact racist. It's easily demonstrated, as I have demonstrated. Like most of these conservatives who are arguing within a few questions, like my initial tweet said, demonstrated that they were in fact racist and they in fact believed that other people are innately inferior. This is the comment that was controversial. Within a few I said it only takes a few questions to get there, and this is true. All you got to do is define racism, and you get people on the record agreeing to the definition of racism, and then you ask them why black people have poor outcomes with poverty, crime, wealth gap, etc., IQ, and if they don't agree with the environmental explanations, they are saying that the answer is genetic, and that is racist by the definition, because they believe they're innately inferior. Pretty easy. So I'd be happy to debate that argument with anybody. But he wants to have a private verbal exchange. And as somebody who's had private verbal exchanges, I happen to know it's very easy to record those. And then it's very easy to clip that however you like and make content out of it for your 30,000 subscribers. So, not saying it's not going to happen, but I will control the topic of the discussion if we're going to talk, privately or publicly, because there's no possible way I can know the difference. Just because you say it's private doesn't mean it won't be recorded and clipped and publicly posted. So I'm happy to have private conversations with people. Doesn't change the terms of the discussion. I still want to narrow the scope if we're having a verbal discussion, whether it is public or private. So yes, I would love to have a private exchange or public exchange with him or other people. Like my channel is always asking for people to talk to. So happy to do that. But anyway, there's a ton more tweets in here I'd love to go through, but it's already been an hour and a half. So I'm going to cut the stream. But again, if you don't think most conservatives are racist, I would love to hear you counter any of the points I made in the main argument. And follow me on Twitter so you can see me blow the fuck out of these chuds and Nazis. It's very entertaining. There's a lot of people following me on Facebook. I'm trying to keep my Facebook a little separate from YouTube because I don't want to dox all my friends and family, basically. But yes. Here, I'm gonna link the initial thread in chat. Easily follow me from there, clicking on my name, and I'll link it in the video as well when I post it. So anyway, thanks for coming. Thanks for watching, whatever you did. And